All right, I think we're live. We'll wait for a few people to join us here. Welcome to those who are watching by replay perhaps afterwards and catching the very beginning of this. We are going to wait just a second for some others to join us here and we'll get started live, but we're going to 10 days removed now from the big storm that moved through Memphis on the Memorial Day weekend, Saturday night, May 27th. I'm going to spend some time recapping that, talking about a lot of different facets of that storm, the kind of the environmental setup we had, some of the products that were issued from the Weather Service and from MemphisWeather.net about exactly what was kind of the setup and what we were expecting leading into that. I'm going to look at some radar data too, pretty interesting radar data from that evening as well. And then just kind of talk about it from a historical significance, what the damage was around the area, how that compares to some other previous big storms that we've had, and then kind of wrap it up from there. So we're glad that you're joining us tonight. My name is Eric Procius. I'm Memphis Weather 1, MemphisWeather.net, and glad that you're able to join us for this discussion. Hopefully by now everybody has got their power on. You're not watching from your mobile phone as you're still sitting in the dark. Hopefully that's not the case. I was looked just a little while ago to see what the outage map looked like, and it was down to about 600 or so customers without power still, now 10 days removed from the from this big storm moving through. A lot of progress has been made, obviously, and unfortunately a lot of the last bit of recovery that's being done, is, at least as far as utilities are concerned, is little pockets of a couple of people here and there, and it just takes a while to get to all of those. But certainly thoughts go out to all of those who've had to deal with this in some form or fashion, and glad that you joined us tonight. So I want to start off by introducing everybody. Again, I'm Eric with MemphisWeather.net, and we'll go right down the line here. To my compadre on the other side there, Alex Herbst, MemphisWeather.net meteorologist. Glad to have you with us tonight, Alex.
Happy to be here, even from back over on the East Coast here for the summer.
Yeah, Alex has got quite a gig up there and on TV in New York City this summer, doing some intern work. So congratulations on that. And you've got 1 year left, I guess, at Mississippi State before you have to start earning your keep, huh?
Yep, that's right. 1 more year there, and then I'll be out in the real world.
Excellent. Glad that you were able to join us. And Alex played a key role in this storm from our perspective as well. We'll get into that here in a little bit. Next down is Daniel Gafford. Glad to have you again with us. You're no stranger to our Hangouts, Daniel, and appreciate you being here again tonight.
Thanks for having me, and I'm jealous of Alex's hair.
Okay. Moving on down. John is trying to hold back tears over there, I think. John Maddox was with us again tonight. How you doing, John? Are you here in the Memphis area, or have you gone camping or something?
No, I'm actually home for now. I was in beautiful, scenic, crime-free Tupelo, Mississippi on Saturday night, and our power went out at the hotel about 1 o'clock. I'm just going to tell Alex to enjoy that hair while you have it, brother. That's all I'm going to say about that.
Yeah, we certainly can feel for that. So did you have flashbacks when the power went out on you down there in Tupelo?
Yeah, well, you know, I was actually asleep. I'd fallen asleep about 10:30 before things really got started here, and then of course when the power went out, I woke up and I hit Twitter and I saw all the damage reports coming in and whatnot. But yeah, it was it's very strange to be laying. You know, it's so funny how you can be asleep and know when the power goes out, and you can be dead asleep and just instantly know that the power went off.
Yeah, it's all the little noises and stuff that you're just used to hearing, the air conditioner running or whatever, that it gets silent and all of a sudden you certainly know. If you didn't hear the big bangs of thunder and the wind roaring over at 80 miles an hour, then you hear the power going out afterwards. First thing I want to do tonight is try and tackle the first issue of this storm that seems to have not been resolved at this point, and I'm not sure why. I guess nobody has really, well, a couple maybe have taken the bull by the horns, but we don't have a really good name on this storm yet. So I put a poll up on Twitter with a few suggestions, hoping that some people might chime in. I have been using Memphis in Mayhem for and blog and so forth since then, and that was one of the choices. We also have the adopted name that MLG&W has been using, which is the Tom Lee storm. That certainly has some significance given the memorial that was tipped over down there for the second time down at Tom Lee Park, the Tom Lee Memorial. So the Tom Lee storm, Hurricane Priscilla has been thrown out a little bit as kind of the secondary to Hurricane Elvis. A more classical name that you might expect the Weather Service is someone to give it, the Mid-South Derecho of 2017. And I can tell you right now that with 81 votes in, Memphis and Mayhem has nearly 50% of the votes. And the Tom Lee storm comes in second. So I don't know if Memphis and Mayhem is that's kind of a long hashtag, but it certainly does remind us that Memphis in May was occurring. I was down there at Tom Lee Park that Saturday. The fireworks ended about 9:45. Quickly shooed everybody out of the park, and an hour later, less than an hour later, 70-mile-an-hour measured winds downtown, and of course the memorial fell over. The big obelisk fell over as well. So timing really couldn't have been much better if you're going to have a great big storm like that move through, given all the events, all the people outdoors and everything, and really cleared out by Sunday morning. By the time Memphis and May had their Great American River Run, a slight delay in that with getting everybody, getting the course kind of back in shape during the overnight, because they used the overnight hours to set up for that morning, and of course it continued to rain and thunder overnight, so there was some delay in that, but really couldn't ask for much better as far as that was concerned. So anyway, we'll call it Memphis and Mayhem for tonight with a secondary nod to the Tom Lee storm. Quickly, just to set up kind of the environmental recap. So what we're looking at that evening or going into that weekend was kind of a stationary front well up to our north. Very, very warm, unstable air. We finally hit 90 degrees for the first time this year today, but it was very close that afternoon, 88, 89 degrees. We had midsummer-like humidity levels. Dew points were in the lower to even mid 70s. So very, very humid air, and that contributed to a very unstable air mass. In fact, the area out to the west of us, the Plains states, southern plains, they were talking about perhaps seeing CAPE values up close to 10,000, which is just unheard of, but just very, very unstable air. Here in the Mid-South in the afternoon, when we had a nice cap on the atmosphere, it was keeping storms from forming during the afternoon. We had a little bit of sunshine, and we got up to about 4,000, 4,500 CAPE, which is way over what we would normally expect, even with just a summertime thunderstorm type scenario. When the storms rolled through, it was still around 3,000, which is excessive, and that's after sunset. Pretty good sheared environment as well. We look at a value called bulk shear, which kind of tells us how much wind shear is out there that would support rotating and severe storms. It was about 40 knots, which is certainly sufficient as well. And then we just had basically this approaching shortwave or upper level energy. It was coming out of southern Missouri. And moving into the area, and knew that that was going to produce, even several days in advance, in fact, knew that there was a potential for severe weather on Saturday and going into Saturday night. And as that shortwave came in, it certainly did fire off a pretty good line of storms over southern Missouri. We'll look at the radar data in a little bit, but basically we had a bow echo that formed, which is indicative of very strong winds. Pushed down through northeast Arkansas, almost basically due north-south, and came right through Shelby County. And we'll look at some other things related to that, some other contributing factors when we look at the radar data in a little bit. But that was kind of the setup. So we had a very, very unstable, sheared environment capable of supporting severe storms even after dark, and that contributed to what we ended up getting. As far as what was kind of the communication out ahead of that, so this was, as I mentioned, this really wasn't a surprise. Not the storm itself was not a surprise, perhaps the magnitude of it. But the Storm Prediction Center had been outlining our area, especially areas to our north, northeast Arkansas, northwest Tennessee, southern Missouri, and a moderate risk a couple of days in advance. That moderate risk extended almost down to the metro by Saturday afternoon. We were at enhanced risk. And the Weather Service was talking about it too. I've asked Daniel to kind of look through some of the products that the Weather Service put out, which would be the ones most likely that the general public would be seeing some variation on those leading up to that event, to kind of see, you know, how it was being handled in advance. So Daniel, you want to take it from there and kind of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, let me get this screen share going here. Let's see. So this right here, this was the day 3 outlook from SPC, as you talked about. So they had a slight risk basically for Texas all the way up to Ohio, with a 15% severe probability. Late on Friday afternoon, they upgraded that to enhanced and moderate, and the moderate was over most of Missouri and the northern part of the Mid-South. And then this one is Saturday afternoon, or Saturday, what's that, around noonish. So not much change. I want to show that the wind probability was 45% for wind gusts over 50 knots, and the hatched area was 65 knots. So all in all, SPC did a pretty good job. You could argue they could have dropped that probability 45% a little further south, but so that was from SPC. Then I looked through. Let me get back to different screen share here. All right. So I looked through the Weather Service forecast discussions, and they started to highlight the threat for Saturday night, Wednesday, Thursday, talking about severe storms with damaging winds, large hail, isolated tornadoes. They weren't overly just in your face screaming, hey, that's going to be 80-mile-per-hour winds, but they definitely highlighted the threat. And then you go to Friday morning, and then Friday afternoon and Saturday morning, they did a good job with a 1 to 2 minute video, which I like, just sort of highlighting the threat, saying time frame 8 p.m. to midnight, damaging winds, large hail, isolated tornadoes possible. So they continued to hammer the point home that this was going to be a definite threat for us. What was interesting is that the day of, especially the morning of, we had a morning round that grazed the northern part of the metro. We were under a severe thunderstorm watch early in the morning as a wave moved through, and then another wave sort of clipped the Jackson area toward Dyersburg. That was like 6 or 7 o'clock. And that, as Eric will talk about, put down an outflow boundary that helped aid in the winds picking up here. But let's see, through the Twitter, about 9 o'clock, they tweeted out that a potent bow echo was moving into northeast Arkansas. And let me get the screen share back here. Let's see, there we go. So here was about the point when the started to move through. See, this is for thunderstorm warning, Blytheville, Kenneth, Ripley, and then this was issued at about 10:15, severe thunderstorm warning. And here's the apex of the bow getting close to the metro, Truman, Mark Tree, Wilson, Osceola. And then we get to, let's see, here was the first one for Shelby County, issued until 11:15, and that clipped the northern half of the county, and then pretty much all of Tipton and the northern part of Fayette. And let's see, keep going here. Lots of warnings that night. This GIF, not GIF, GIF they posted was about strong winds ripping through Memphis, and I know Eric again will take a look at this, but showing that all of a sudden the winds just really ramped up right around Highway 51, and then this is the one that caught my attention, the radar screen grab with the highlighted area right in the middle of the city with a little annotated 80+ mile-per-hour winds. So all in all, I'd say they were on top of it quite a bit and had a good handle on things.
Cool, thanks, Daniel. Yeah, that was like I said, we were looking at this early, and in fact, talking with some guys at work about it, we were kind of thinking back what was going on during that week, and we'd been looking at the European model, and not that any of the models didn't do particularly bad or good. They all had the general scenario, but even back as far as like Tuesday and Wednesday, European model was picking up on a pretty large, it really looked like a bow echo on the precipitation fields moving through about midnight on Saturday night. And that's 4 or 5 days in advance. And of course, that far out, you go, okay, well, we're going to have to be concerned about storms, which you're not really worried too much about, timing and severity and stuff, because that obviously can change quite a bit. But in fact, it had a pretty good handle on it. And so that, stuff like that is what ends up contributing to, some of the concern and discussion that goes into those, the forecast discussions and the products and stuff that go out. Relative to that. So good recap there, Daniel. Thanks. And you're right. The Weather Service and Storm Prediction Center did a really good job of handling that event. And I'll say that looking at that SPC graphic, we talked about that 45% risk area. I'll just take a minute here and share with you exactly what happened over the entire area. Where is my it's not showing. I just share my whole screen here. Let's see. Are we seeing the storm reports there? I think we should be. But you can see where that moderate risk was and where the wind occurred after that. The blue are the wind reports. The greens here are the hail reports, and then a couple of tornado reports. But the moderate risk really did have where the most hail, wind, tornado threat combined kind of were. And basically what happened is, as we've looked at it since then, there was actually perhaps 3 different derechos that occurred during the day Saturday into Saturday night. The first one being up here, the northern one up over the Ohio Valley, all the wind reports in a line there. It's kind of a second one that it's pretty close to derecho status as well, that kind of went through between that and our area, kind of the Nashville area, originated again up in Missouri. And then this one right down here through the south, that dropped south out of northeast Arkansas and went into all the way into North Alabama. That was number 3 of the evening and the one that got us. But there were, I would say there's probably on average, you might see 3 to 5 derechos a year. And basically a derecho is a long-lived severe windstorm. It has to be basically kind of continuous severe winds, nearly continuous for over 250 miles is the current definition, with some extreme winds in there as well. And we may see 3 to 5 of those in a year over the entire United States, basically the portions of the U.S. that get these, which are basically from the Midwest down into our area. And on this particular event, there were 3 different separate, distinct bow echo derechos that occurred. So really can't fault SPC on that. Yeah, they probably could have extended that wind risk out a little bit further, but you just don't know necessarily how far those storms are going to propagate outside of your risk areas there. So let's wanted to talk just for a minute also about some of the products that we put out here on MemphisWeather.net, starting with Thursday afternoon about 3 o'clock. I tweeted the SPC graphic and started talking about the likelihood of some storms being severe, with wind damage being a primary threat on Saturday night. So again, we're not narrowing down the time too much, but over 48 hours out, started talking about the potential for that on Saturday night. On Friday, did a blog right after lunchtime and put a graphic with that that discussed 60-mile-an-hour wind in the time frame around midnight, mentioned as early as 10 p.m., expressing concern over very heavy rain, lightning, continuous lightning, and 60+ mile-an-hour winds. That was midday on Friday. And then Saturday morning, just before noon, put out an updated graphic with mention of 70-mile-an-hour winds in a time frame between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. and updated that at 4 o'clock. There was a little bit of concern as we went into later that afternoon, and we'll look at the radar data in a minute, and Daniel mentioned it, but those storms that were kind of forming up to our northeast in West Tennessee. So the timing was adjusted a little bit earlier to account for the possibility of that. And about 4 o'clock, I gave an ETA between 8 and 11 p.m. For the storms, which would have accounted if those had moved farther south. They would have come in a little bit quicker. Instead, we got the outflow out of that. And then about 5 o'clock, bumped that back again to after 10 o'clock, 60 to 70 mile an hour winds was the primary threat. So Everything was fairly in line as far as what the potential was for the threats. And I'll note also when Daniel went through those warnings, the first warning that was out for basically areas north of I-40, the one that went till 10:45, if I'm not mistaken, had 70-mile-an-hour winds. And remember that severe weather, basically severe winds, start at 58. So most of the time in a borderline strong to severe case, you're going to see mentions of 60-mile-an-hour winds. They start talking 70, 80-mile-an-hour winds. There's a lot. Not only does that mean 70 or 80-mile-an-hour winds, but there's higher confidence that we're going to get some severe weather when they start putting in the potential for these higher winds. So that first warning had the mention of 70-mile-an-hour winds. The second warning that came out right after that, probably, I think about, remind me, Daniel, might have been about 10:40, something like that, had a mention in it of 80-mile-an-hour winds. And so,
yeah, I was trying to pull up
10:43. There it is.
Yeah, they said, 10:51, severe thunderstorm was located near Shelby Forest State Park, moving southeast at 60, and the hazard was 80-mile-per-hour wind gusts and quarter-size hail.
Yep.
And the impact listed at the bottom, which came out pretty prophetic: extensive tree damage and power outages are likely.
How about that? So definitely fell right in line with the warnings as well. As far as the damage that was caused, actually, I take that back. I want to switch over to the radar here. So let me again pull the screen share up, and let's see if I can get my radar. There we go. So what we're looking at here is a replay of the radar, and this starts at 9 o'clock. And we're going to go through basically till about 12:30. I'll show you a couple of different products. And guys, if you want to chime in, if you're seeing things that you want to throw in there, please feel free to do it. But we have about 9 o'clock, storms up here to the north across, this is southern Missouri up here at the top, Memphis obviously right here in the middle. We had these storms that were that fired out ahead of this main area that was across southern Missouri, northwest Tennessee, extending all the way down kind of to the southeastern portion of West Tennessee along the Tennessee River here, but Jackson, Henderson, Ripley, Blytheville, kind of that area. And these storms had been firing up here and moving to the southeast, and they had put out this outflow boundary, which you see out ahead of these storms. So it's basically just south of Covington, north of Somerville, south of Bolivar. It's right through there. So I'm going to step through this and just kind of show you as this outflow, so here's the outflow right through here, moving back to the southwest. It's entering Shelby County, and you see the line of storms. This is the Bow Echo up here, which will have the very strong winds in it, almost due north of Shelby County here, and that's going to dive to the south. And you'll watch it basically as that line moves in, you'll see that it intersects this outflow boundary that's also moving into the Memphis area. So as I go forward a little bit more, you see storms continue to grow along the backside of it. Here is the outflow coming in ahead of that storm, right along the leading edge of the storm, and then extends out a little bit ahead of it down here to the south. Here's the other outflow boundary now, basically across northeastern Shelby County. And as we move this forward, you see most of the big storms extend up here to the north and east of Memphis. And just to give you an idea there's the warnings as they came out. I didn't have that on a minute ago, but this is the warning for Shelby, Tipton, northern Crittenden. And you see right in this area, northwest Shelby County, this is about where the tip of that outflow boundary coming in from the northeast intersects this outflow boundary coming in from the northwest. And I'm going to go right through here. And you see right in here is about where we had that very strong microburst that occurred, and it's right where those two outflows came together. That red square right there is where we had the 100 to 105 mile an hour wind. And as I continue to go through here, there's the next warning, and I'm going to turn those off because it's cluttered. You can see those storms move right through Shelby County. It's basically diving south, entering North Mississippi now. This is at 11:18. And as I go forward, you see the heaviest storms now are off to the east, but this was where the back edge of that is where that heavy, that strong wind occurred, and where the wind damage continued right down into northeast Mississippi behind this line right here. And you notice here, this is 12:15. It's dried out here in a good part of the metro. The storms are down to the south, and I think I take this out to 12:30. But you see, this is the next area that came in later in the night. So after everybody's power had gone off and we got a little bit of a lull, then this next area came in and it continued to rain and thunder a good part of the night, just about the whole rest of the night after about 1 o'clock in the morning. So let me go through this one more time. I'm going to let it run through in a regular animation here so you can see it all as it occurs. These pictures are about every 5 minutes or so, and then I slow it up there right over Shelby County. But you see that line just blast right on through here, diving down from the north. And where that intersecting outflow occurred right there in the Fraser area is where we had the severe wind damage. So let's go. I'm going to zoom this in. You can see some locations on there. So this is just before. This is 1047. Here's the first outflow. The other outflow is right along it, basically at the leading edge of these storms. And here comes the storm. You start to see it almost looks a little bit there. Some people would look at that and say, oh, that's a hook echo. Well, not positive that's a hook echo. So I think there's storms that are firing up on these on the convergence of these outflows, and so it's kind of a new storm that's forming out ahead of here. But you can see then you get the big storms that occur right behind it. I want to switch over to the velocity signature and show you how this played out. And this will show you what the wind is doing. So as we go through here, I'll kind of talk to you about exactly what we're seeing. But the radar is right here in Millington. And so any of these green areas are wind that is blowing towards the radar. So these winds over Tipton County are coming in towards Millington. So this is a northeast wind, and this is the outflow boundary right through here where these storms that were up to the northeast of us have put out this outflow or gust front. It's basically like a mini cold front, and it's right there along that line. You can kind of see a little line where the greens start right in there. Up here is the inbound very strong winds associated with the storms up to the north. And so you'll see as we go through that pushes down to the southeast. The outflow now is basically down to Millington. It's right through here, and this one's coming in from the northwest. And these winds up here, even these are, we're getting severe damage up here as well. These are running about 65 knots, 70, 75 miles an hour. And this is up at 4,000 feet. The radar doesn't look straight across at the ground. It tips up just slightly. So the farther you get from the radar, the higher you're looking in the storm. So we're seeing about 70, 75 mile an hour winds up there at about 4,000 feet. We'll continue to move this forward. Now you see the outflow right through here coming in from the northeast, and it's turned red. And that's because these winds are now past Millington. So those winds, that outflow being past Millington, means the winds are now blowing away from Millington or away from the radar. So we're seeing the reds. And you can definitely see right through here is where that outflow is. And here comes the other one coming in. Again, we've got somewhere in the neighborhood of about the same, about 70 mile an hour winds there. And this is down to about 1,200 feet. And you'll notice right in here, we start to get a storm that pops up. You see the very strong winds right in here. Here comes the outflow boundary. So we had kind of a new, maybe a downburst of some sort right in this area that is basically kind of up by Shelby Farms, right along the river. And it's going to intersect that other boundary. And right there where the red was where the damage occurred. I'm going to zoom in. So we've got very strong winds coming towards the downtown area. These are running about 50 knots, so that's severe winds, 55, 60 miles an hour at 900 feet. And here's where that pops up right in here. You see this colors brighten up all of a sudden. This is about 80 mile an hour winds at 575 feet above the ground. And those winds, basically what we're seeing there is there was a microburst that occurred right in that area as those as those outflows collided. You have the big storm overhead. It drops its wind, just basically a whole downburst of wind that came crashing down right on that area where we had all the tree damage, the big microburst signature. If you've seen that picture of the trees that are basically flattened, I'll show that in a minute. But that's where that occurred, and then the wind spread out from that microburst, and so that's what we're seeing right in here. Is those winds around 80 miles an hour or so, about 500 feet above the ground, and it's pushing across the Fraser and into the Raleigh area right in there. And of course, you got the outflow going down here. Strong winds over downtown. Tomley Park is right in here. These winds are pushing up to about 70 miles an hour in there. and we'll watch this area up around Fraser, and you notice that just continues to spread. And here's all of that going through the northern half of Memphis down towards Overton Park. Midtown is going to get hit by this one right in here. So we're going to see all these winds, and now that goes several minutes out. This is at 11:07. Widespread, though, 60, 70 mile an hour winds across a good part of the metro. And as I zoom that out, you can really see how that outflow just takes over. So let me put the whole thing in motion again. You can watch it go all the way through. Outflow coming in from the northeast, the big outflow from the northwest, the collision right there, and then the outflow continuing to move off to the east with those storms. So it's a very interesting radar data there. Certainly is shows you kind of why we got some of those winds. Now you hear you know, kind of the play on this as well, that we had 100 to 105 mile an hour winds over the whole county, and that's not the case. What I just showed you there in the radar data shows you we had a max winds of somewhere around that, and they were up in the 51 and Watkins area, right around the Memphis police and fire training academies. But the winds that spread out that covered the very large area were widespread 60 to 80 mile an hour winds. So that is what causes their trees to get uprooted, snapped off, power lines, traffic signals. I saw a couple of billboard signs when I actually drove up that 51 Watkins area this afternoon just to get a look at it because I hadn't been up there. And right in the area where that microburst occurred, there are a couple of billboards that are almost basically folded right in half. There's obviously a gust of wind. They're facing kind of to the north, and that's the direction that wind came in from, that straight line wind. And it basically pushed right in the middle of them and kind of folded them up like an accordion. So, really, really strong wind with that damage. So that's kind of what the radar looked like. So how are we covering the storm that night? I mentioned that I was downtown with doing the weather for Memphis in May and making sure that they were aware this was coming and to wrap it up and get folks out of there. And I was very, very grateful to have Alex Herbst on covering our social media side for MemphisWeather.net. And he had taken the reins on this storm as it was coming in, was doing all the nowcasting on it. I got home to be able to jump in with him about 10:55, and at 11:05 I was without power. And so I made a cameo appearance for a few minutes, but Alex carried it on till I think probably 1:30 in the morning, something like that. So our hero in disguise for MemphisWeather.net that kept this information flow was Alex. So Alex, kind of tell us what you were seeing. I know you're brand new at this. You've seen some storms. You got your bachelor's degree. You're a meteorologist. You've seen some of this kind of stuff, but probably nothing quite to this extent. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, definitely not anything to this extent. And looking at some of that same stuff we were just talking about, the radar images, the base velocities, I can tell this was not a normal type of event. This is not a typical type of thunderstorm that we were dealing with here for the metro. And we were fortunate, really, with that timing, as you discussed, that Memphis in May got out just in time before this event really pushed through the downtown area. Redbirds game ended just before this really pushed through the area. So we got fortunate with that, where we didn't have a lot of people that would be in outdoor areas and areas that could become very dangerous as much as it could have been. But really what caught my eye in watching this was how quickly it pushed through, but also how quickly we had to adapt how we were talking about it. So we were going from talking about an approaching thunderstorm complex to a situation where we had a large part of a very populated area without power, without access to a lot of information. So we had to be able to adapt what we were talking about, be able to share images of what was happening, and also information about, here's what you do if you lose your power. Here's what happens if you need to be able to get in contact with Memphis Power, Light, and Water. So we had to really adapt our strategy, and we made it work great.
Yeah, it is one of those where you like you said, you do kind of have to adjust on the fly. And one of the things that's talked about when we talk about how to communicate weather information is that people do react, or those that are ahead of a storm tend to respond when they not just see radar data or hear somebody say this is what's going to happen, but when you start seeing pictures coming in and seeing exactly what's going on, if there's a tornado threat for an area, and somebody can get a sky cam on it and show you the tornado that's on the ground, the response rate to the recommendations of taking precautions goes way up. And so it's the same case with this too. Now, being in the middle of the night, it's a little bit harder to get some of those, some of the pictures and so forth of exactly what's going on. So a lot of that doesn't come in until the next morning, but there was certainly enough that we were able to get that that information out. And you did a great job. And I'll tell you what, one of the things that we kind of pride ourselves on here at MemphisWeather.net is being responsive to those who are reaching out to us. We're very aware that social media is a two-way communication, and like to try and respond to everybody as quickly as we can. I went back afterwards just to spot check, some of the questions that came in and so forth. And, we had, Alex, had responses out to all of those. I didn't see anything more than 2 minutes. And not only are you responding to people, but you're putting out the information, all the warnings and all of that. So really, really appreciate, again, the efforts that you made that night. And, it's one of those scenarios, obviously it doesn't happen all that often, but I think, I know we gained a lot of followers, and I think that really helps to solidify kind of what we're doing here. So I appreciate that, and hopefully others recognize that as well. So
and I appreciate that, and I think we should definitely keep encouraging our followers to keep sending in those reports, whether it's just sending in a tweet or sending out those pictures. Don't get in harm's way to be able to do it, but definitely keep sending in those reports.
Yep, definitely a good way to make others aware. And when those pictures come in and so forth, we're retweeting them or sending them right back out so that others can see the same information we're seeing. And it helps us to know when you're sending reports in that what we're talking about, what we're seeing on radar is actually occurring, or maybe it's not. In some cases, we're looking at radar and we're seeing those winds aloft and thinking, well, we're going to get 60-mile-an-hour winds at the surface, and we don't get any reports, nothing's coming in, and it's very possible that those winds are just aloft and they aren't actually making it down to ground level. So sometimes the lack of reports tells us just as much as the ones that do come in, but that certainly helps to have those. So we definitely stayed as much on top of that as we could. As it gets into the wee hours of the morning, Alex has been going all day and into the night, and he's an hour ahead on New York time. So when he signs off at 1:30 in the morning, it's actually 2:30 where he's at. And I was without power and running on very low 4G coverage and trying to keep the phone from completely dying. We had to cut it off there at some point, but got through the biggest part of that. So again, appreciate that. So let's talk a little bit about what actually happened in the aftermath here. I've got a few pictures I'd like to screen share, and then I'm going to turn it over to John and let him kind of talk a little bit about some of the aftermath. And if any of you have questions or comments that you'd like to insert, please feel free to tweet us at MemphisWeather1, or if you're watching on YouTube, there's a chat session running there too. You can drop your questions and stuff in there. But let's take a look at, first I want to show the microburst that occurred up there at 51 in Watkins. So let me open this up and see if I can screen share. Let me share my entire screen here. So hopefully you're seeing this aerial photograph, and shout out to Casey Kirby with the Memphis Police Department Air Support Division. He sent a couple pictures into a local broadcaster, and those were sent back out, and reached out and asked if he could provide some more information about what he was seeing. And actually he had some additional photos, and I really appreciate him passing those on. I sent them on to the Weather Service as well so they could see the damage. I drove by here today, went right along that road. That is US 51 north of Watkins, basically kind of the northeast of the training academies for police and fire. And I'll tell you, driving down this road, that is pretty hard to see. You'll notice right along the road there's still quite a bit of trees kind of standing, but this area out here is basically completely flattened. And so by sending those to the Weather Service, they were able to take a look at what kind of damage was produced there, especially from an aerial perspective. It's a lot easier to see that. Obviously, we have trees that are all blown down in the same direction here. And in fact, I'm going to put up the second picture that I've got that shows that even better. This is another one taken from a different angle. So 51 is back here in the background now, and we're looking to the north-northwest. And I've annotated on there the arrows because you can see the direction that those trees have fallen in that fairly large area. It's not unusual, as we saw all around the city, to see a tree here and there uprooted, or to have a few trees snapped off or large branches. But it is pretty unusual to see a widespread area where basically just about everything has been collapsed by the weight of the wind pushing across it. And so Weather Service determined that was most likely 100 to 105 mile per hour winds that would do such a thing. The arrows there indicating the direction those trees fell, and that is not a tornado that did that. That is basically a classic microburst signature, damage signature, where you got the wind moving. It's straight line wind, but it kind of fans out from a point. So back here, kind of to the north of this picture, is roughly where that microburst would have come down. So it is a descending air that hits the ground and then spreads out, and that's the direction the storms were traveling. So that's the direction most of the wind force went, and they spread out from that point. And all of that, all of those trees falling and everything probably happened within a matter of 60 to 120 seconds. It just hits so quickly. The storms were moving at 60 miles an hour. The wind is descending and spreading out at 100 miles an hour. It just doesn't take any time at all for those things to get pushed off in that. And I think that's a really, really impressive look at what the force of that does. And obviously, we don't have tree damage like that across the whole county. So this is not, something where we had 100-mile-an-hour winds across the entire area. We had 60, 70, some 80-mile-an-hour winds that took down trees in various areas, all over. But to get that kind of a signature is pretty impressive. The other impressive picture from this, and probably the one that will live on, and obviously the Tom Lee name that MLGW used and a lot of folks are using, comes from this picture here. This is the Tom Lee Memorial obelisk that was standing tall and proud there on the Mississippi River in Tom Lee Park, and about 10:55 that evening. There's actually some video of it too, and I don't have that loaded, but if one of you guys has it, you might be able to screen share it. But there's actually MPD video. They had a sky cop sitting over here, and they had video of the wind actually blowing that thing over. And so that is a picture that's definitely one that's representative of exactly what this storm can do or did do. And estimates are now of several months and $60,000 to $70,000 to basically rebuild that memorial down there on Tom Lee Park. And for those that have a thing about statues in Memphis, and some of the comments I saw on my Facebook page from underneath this picture, this is a memorial that was dedicated to someone who saved a whole bunch of folks that were on a riverboat that was sinking. This was a heroic act that was memorialized with this particular monument. And it's only fallen twice. Actually, I shouldn't say it has only fallen twice. It has fallen twice since it was built in 1954. The first time was Hurricane Elvis in 2003. The second time was last Saturday. So kind of interesting how that works out. But that's another kind of a signature event that will be remembered here on that particular event. So, John, why don't we talk a little bit more about some of the damage that occurred, some of the cleanup that's taken place, and if you would put this in some historical context for us.
Well, at the peak of the storm, as you know, it's probably been browbeaten to all of us, about 188,000 people were without power throughout the Memphis service area. I checked with Chickasaw Electric today, who's just to our east in Fayette County, and they had about 2,900 without power at the height of the storm. Didn't get Entergy. I know there was some lines down across Church Road at 55. Quite a few power outages. So the storm did quite a number on the local utilities, and of course Memphis is a city of trees, and we have to take the good with the bad with that, and part of that was we had a lot of trees come down, and as you know from ice storms and such, when trees come down, they typically don't fall and miss everything and power days. So here's just a comparison for folks to see. Hopefully you can all see that. This is just a chart of notable severe wind events in the Memphis area and the associated power outages. The storm we had last weekend is the second highest number of, or third highest number of total power outages in MLG&W history. Of course, the first will be Hurricane Elvis, and these numbers are just look at. 82% of MLG&W customers lost power in Hurricane Elvis. That means 8 out of every 10. Daniel said earlier today he was in the lucky 18% that did not. I was not quite as fortunate. My parents were without for 17 days. They were among the last restored. But this, to me, just looking at this chart shows you where things are now. And, you know, Hurricane Elvis did about $31 million worth of damage to the infrastructure for MLG&W, and it took about 17 days to get everybody back online. The June 17, 2009 Derecho, which, you know, kind of ends up getting forgotten somewhat in Memphis lore, took 131,000 people down, took about 7 days and about $9 million in damages. And then there's a couple of more. April 4th, of course, April 4th, 2011. If we'd have only known how bad April 2011 would have been, that took 70,000 without power. And then in June of 2012, 15,000 lost power for a couple of days. So the two kind of sentinel events we use here for electricity and you know, damage are Hurricane Elvis, but also, of course, Ice Storm 94. Ice Storm 94 saw about 250,000 customers without power at the time. That's roughly half of what MLG&W had. You've got to remember, as people move out of Memphis, MLG&W's actual numbers go down. So they had close to 500,000 at that time, and $14.5 million with 15 days to reach total restoration. The big thing, and Eric, you pointed this out, the big difference for me was after Hurricane Elvis, at the same time, there were still 50,000 people without power 10 days out. It's actually, should say 10 days out. We are right about 600 people, which is it's bad. It's terrible for those 600 people, but those two numbers are just amazing to me, and it shows how far things have really come on the utility side. We have a ways to go, but things are much better now than they were in 94, of course, in 03. You know, one of the things that folks in that industry do, and Eric, you know this as well, is you have to learn from previous events and go, this worked, this didn't work. And, you know, MLG&W realized, you know, we need to get crews in here faster. We need to get crews. And, you know, they have upped their tree trimming budget now, I think is about $9 million they've spent in tree trimming, whereas up until like 2003, I think it's like $3 or $4 million. So, you know, we've realized what works, and MLG&W, and I think it was about 100 crews from all over the Southeast came in. And this is, if you don't know, this is very, very common. When an area gets hit, you know, MLG&W will send crews out. So together, and I saw a couple comments that people had heard that MLG&W didn't work because it was the Memorial Day weekend. They didn't start till Tuesday, which was a bunch of baloney, because they had a large number of folks restored over the weekend, 24/7, and remarkably no injuries on their part, and they do exceptionally dangerous work. As you can imagine, you know, high voltage lines. So hats off to MLG&W, down to just 600 people without power. And for those 600, just stay strong and stay with it. And hopefully the lights will be on soon.
Good. That's a that's a very interesting recap. I'm going to leave that screen share up here for just a minute. I remember back to the to that Hurricane Elvis, and I knew that it was a very large number, and I didn't realize until you put that up there that was what the ratio was, but 80%. And actually, to have 80%, and if you remember back to all the damage, and I think, you know, these estimated costs here are on the utility side, so that is not, you know, insured losses and damage from to actual buildings and infrastructure and so forth as well. I mean, that's the utility side. I look back at I had done a blog on the 10-year anniversary of Hurricane Elvis, and the total estimated loss for that event in 2003 dollars was $500 million. And so if you'll remember back some of the pictures and so forth of that event, Beale Street was closed for a few days. If you'll remember, they were building FedEx Forum, and there was a massive crane that got toppled, basically crunched in half from the winds. There were multiple recordings, actual wind recordings over 100 miles an hour from down in the river area where the storm came across the river and went right down into downtown, and of course all of the damage in Midtown. And to have the damage restored in 17 days. Now I know we've made a lot of progress, and we can say, well, we got 188,000 restored roughly in 10 days here. But to have all that cleaned up in 17 days back at that time is actually pretty unbelievable. Because we're basically just about half of what the outages were at that time, and taking 10 days. So, really interesting to see how those compare. And then, of course, everybody talks about the ice storm, and the ice storm was a whole different. The numbers are high there as well, but with the ice storm. One of the things we had to wait on for that is it's really hard to go out there and start restoring power when the streets are covered in ice. So we kind of had to wait for weather where the storm blows through and you can kind of get out there and start your work. That one we kind of had to wait just at least a good day or so before they could probably get out there at all, because of just the amount of ice that was on roadways and bridges and all of that.
Yeah, and Eric, one more thing about Ice Storm 94 that a lot of people forget. It was actually worse south and east of here. They got a lot more ice. And if you know anything about electricity, most of our electricity comes from TVA areas to the south and east. So they had several big transmission lines go down. And that's not as simple as just sending out a little truck and running a guy up there in a bucket to get that back operational. So, that was a whole different, like you said, it was just a whole different set of circumstances.
Yep, certainly was. So hats off to MLG&W and really to the whole coordinated effort that's been ongoing. MLG&W doesn't do this alone. We've got traffic lights that are out, and so you have to have emergency response to get trees off of people's homes, or check homes and see if there's a tree going through it. If somebody was home, you have to have police and so forth out directing at major intersections where traffic lights are out, sometimes for days. And so it really was a well-coordinated effort. There were a couple of comments that were made last week, and I'm sure it was probably just because, we like to say that we just, can't. If we knew exactly what was going to happen with the weather, perhaps we could be better prepared. I think that the warnings, the communication leading up to the event were exceptional. If you didn't know that this storm was coming, then you just hadn't been paying attention, at least as far as a threat. Now, we couldn't tell you that, you're going to have 100 miles an hour in one pocket and 80 miles an hour over this area, 2 days in advance. But, there were some comments by officials about we had no way of knowing what the winds were going to be, or, the only thing that caught us by surprise was it was worse than the weather forecaster said. And I'll just tell you that on an event like that, if you tell people 3 days in advance that we're going to have an event that's going to rank number 2 in power outages for the city, and it doesn't happen, they will never listen to you again. So you really, you give them the best information you possibly can. Hopefully they can have their preparations ready in case, and then when the event happens, respond accordingly. And obviously MLG&W did just that. They did not take a week to decide to start calling in crews from other places. I think by Tuesday they had 70 something crews here from out of town, and those places people are coming from, they've got a day's drive to get here. So they're responding on Memorial Day weekend to get here. Went over, I think even last night, they still had 100 crews out there working on basically 300 or 400 outages. So they have saturated the area and certainly done everything that they could. I think that and you guys can feel free to chime in on this, but I think the local government authorities responded. They opened shelters where needed. They, are working to get SNAP benefits and stuff reimbursed already for loss that might have been occurred due to power outages. A lot of people say, well, where's the federal disaster declaration? How come we haven't heard from Trump? How come we haven't had all the money pouring in yet? Well, there's a process that happens to be able to do that, and basically what that does is going to allow all of the money that's being spent in the local area on all of the recovery get reimbursed up to 80% by the federal government, and that will happen. They've reached the level that's required to be able to declare the disaster, and so that is coming. Don't worry, but it really doesn't matter. What matters is the response that occurred right after the storm. The fact that hear all these stories of people taking care of each other out there when it's going to be a while till you get power. Neighbors and shelters and churches, other religious organizations stepping up, drives going on to take up money and help out, and that's really good to see. That's one of the reasons I'm proud to be here as part of this community, because they always step up in a time of need. So that's my soapbox on the event. So what can we do going forward? Can we cut more trees back? Can we put our power lines underground? What do you think, John? We just bury everything and then we won't have this problem again.
Yeah, I'm going to pass the hat here this afternoon as soon as we're done here, and we'll just take care of it. No, thanks. It's that always seem to ask this question right after a storm. Well, why aren't all the electrical lines underground? Well, the answer is pretty simple, as it usually is for most things: money. So if you're a math person and you look at this, over the last 30 years or so, those numbers I showed you, MLG&W has spent probably around $100 million, not only on storm damages, but also things like tree trimming, things like that. Currently, it is estimated that it would take about $3.6 billion with a B, also known as Daniel Gafford money, $3.6 billion with a B, to replace the remaining 60% of electrical lines underground. Currently, MLG&W is actually about double the national average, about 40 to probably up around 45% now of electrical lines underground already. Since 1996, all new construction is required to have their lines underground. Hence, in my neighborhood, and Eric, I'm sure Eric, especially in your neighborhood, we don't have any power poles. Everything's underground. And then one of the other things is what we call negative payback in the business and in the business world. And so what you look at is that underground electrical cables last about, on average, 20 to 25 years less than overhead cables. And you may say, well, why is that? Well, you have things like when you run anything through the earth, you have things that will collapse the conduit, destroy the lines, the dirt, the water, everything just eventually wears on those lines. While overhead lines, if you don't have big wind storms or ice storms, can last about 50 years before you have to replace them. Also with underground lines, what people don't realize is if something does happen, lightning does strike one of the entry points and it fries the line, the digging is much more expensive and time consuming to repair versus, sending out a bucket truck, sending a guy up in a truck and hooking a line back up. Also, underground lines fed by overhead transmission lines, which can also be damaged in a storm. Had several people ask me, well, why did my cable go out? My power didn't go out, but why did my cable go out? Well, cable companies sometimes have to use signal boosters, just like we all know what those are, to move signal down the line. Same thing with AT&T and phone service. Same thing with cell towers. So it's not as simple as just, passing the hat, rates. I think one estimate I saw, in order to bury the rest of the lines, our rates would have to probably come close to quadruple. And that number probably goes up even more because you have, again, people leaving the MLG&W service area. So now you have, again, that what we call negative payback. So it doesn't make prudent financial sense to bury everything, especially when I think I showed five windstorm events in the last, if you count Ice Storm 94 in the last, 20-something years, we've had a major event. So it just doesn't make a lot of sense financially to bury all the lines. Some people have accused MLG&W of inflating this number, but I can tell you from my business and what I know how very, very expensive it is to bury any kind of cable. So this number is probably about right. maybe even a little more, depending on, the other thing you've got to think about that people don't think is you couldn't just go out to Eric's house and start digging a hole in his backyard if you're Memphis Light Gas and Water. Not only will Eric be upset, but Eric's mortgage company will be upset. His neighbors will be upset. So you've got to get easements and all that. And it's not just as simple as sending out a bunch of trucks and a bunch of backhoes and have guys start digging holes. So, it's just one of those things that, yep, it stinks. It was terrible. Like I say, my parents were without power for 17 days. After Hurricane Elvis, I went 9 days after the ice storm. It's terrible, but I think that it just doesn't make any business sense at all to have a serious discussion about burying existing lines. What they're doing now is, as lines die, as things happen, they're going underground. But that there's no in time. I mean, there's no way we could do that. We could not bury all these lines before the next event comes around. So anyway, so just be patient, be calm, understand the economics of why we are blessed with some of the cheapest utilities in the country, and just realize that, it's just something that you can't really prepare for. You can't have you just can't, because, even if the big tower gets taken down, now you've got a lot of people without power. So it's not prudent, to steal from George H. Bush, it's not prudent to bury all the lines.
We're not going to do it. We're not going to do it.
Not going to. Taxes bad, burying lines bad.
But if we did do it, it would be huge. Huge. All right. So that's some
huge. Huge.
Good takeaway there, especially those first two bullet points that were on there. The fact that we've talked about all these storms and how much it costs to repair afterwards, and that to bury the rest of the utilities would cost 36 times that. Your rate of return is just simply not there. You're not going to see that happening, and nobody wants to see their rates go up that much for the possibility that you lose power because one of the big transmission poles comes down even though you're buried. Then you're going to be complaining even more about why you're paying so much, and your power still goes out. So I'll open it up here. It's about 9 o'clock, so I wanted to end it right about here, but I'll open it up to all you guys. Does anybody have any additional comments they'd like to make that we haven't talked about, or comments on things we already have?
One thing just about the power outages, I know MLGW has tweeted this out, but there is a specific order that they go through when they restore power. It's basically hospitals, water treatment, sewer treatment first, and then kind of go down from there for big outages. Had a friend on a crew who on Sunday was in the St. Jude area trying to get power back there. So there is a specific order, and if a tree falls on a power line in your backyard and you're the only one without power, you will not be restored until all the other big circuits and other outages are repaired.
Yeah, and Daniel, that's one interesting thing that you bring up that's important. I know MLGW said they've tweeted out. They've tweeted also out that it is your responsibility if your weatherhead on your property is damaged, you have to get that repaired by an electrician and get code enforcement out to look at that and say that it's okay before MLGW can even restore your power. So, if you're one of these 600, chances are that's probably what's going on. It's probably in about half. So just take a look at your weatherhead outside, and if you don't know what that looks like, MLGW's thrown about 10 pictures of it up. So but that is your responsibility as well.
And just to beat the dead horse to death again here, make sure that when the power does go out that you are calling MLGW and not just assuming that they know what's going on. You have to call them and make sure that they know that your house is without power, because they've got a lot to take care of. So make sure you keep that in mind going forward.
Yeah, good point. And I've also seen that as outages are restored or people around you are restored, if you're still without, you can call again because a lot of times one outage will mask another. You may have a transformer that's blown by your house where 4 or 5 people are affected, but you also have, on a circuit of 2,500 that's out. And so if the 2,500 are restored and you're not, then it's likely there's another outage that transformer could have been masked by the fact that there was a larger outage over the top of it. So, and I'm not gonna bother to call anymore. I have a smart meter. So now they're just gonna know because they're constantly checking my house to see how much utilities I'm using, and they know when my power is out. So But they did say that actually has come in, has proven some benefit already, even this year, because they can ping houses just to see if there's power flowing to your house, and that's one way they can check after an outage is restored, like a circuit, to see, did everybody get their power, or they can tell, without you even calling if you need to be restored. So potential benefit there. Anything else? Anybody have any last comments before we sign off?
Thanks for nothing, Bluffs.
Yeah, really, Pyramid did no good. It enhanced the storm. See, now we have to tear it all down, put it back, get the Bluffs out of here. John, you want to tell people where they can find you if they have any other questions? You had some good content tonight. Appreciate that. You got some insight in there, and thanks for being on tonight.
No problem. I'm on the Twitter at TigerJohnM. Warning, if you don't like weather, wrestling, or Memphis athletics, I'm probably not the best follow, because that's pretty much it on my timeline these days. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome, John. Thanks. Daniel, if anybody happened to have a question for you, maybe about child rearing or something like that, maybe where could they reach you?
Child rearing questions would go to @JohnRoseman.
Here you go.
Otherwise, I'm @Daniel Gafford.
Great. Thanks for being on and contributing tonight. Appreciate that. Alex, again, thank you so much for the efforts the other night. Herculean, I appreciate it. And if folks want to ask a question to a budding meteorologist who's about to finish his master's, what your dissertation is going to be on, where would they direct that to?
Well, they can direct that to me on Twitter, Facebook, anywhere really, to @AlexHerbst_WX.
Alex Herbst WX. It's HERBSTWX. Appreciate you being on, Alex. Thank you so much. And of course, you can find me at MemphisWeather.net. Any of my team will be happy to respond to you in a timely fashion with at least a GIF, if not something more beneficial to you. And be sure to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. As you could tell from this storm, we keep you updated throughout the event. We're your wall-to-wall on social media, and we appreciate everybody that follows us along. Hope everybody has a good night. I hope your power is restored and we can settle down into a nice summer pattern here as we go into June. First 90-degree day there today. We're just about there. Thanks for joining us tonight, and we'll talk to you again later.